Okay, hi, my name is Madeleine Gruber, and I'll be talking about question 1 from quiz 4. So the question states, in many parliamentary procedures, a supermajority is defined as an excess of 60% of voting members. In a poll conducted by Gallup Organization on May 10, 1939, 1,561 adult Americans were asked, do you think the United States will have to fight Japan within your lifetime? Of the 1,561 respondents, 954 said no. Does this constitute sufficient evidence that the supermajority of Americans did not feel the United States would have to fight Japan within their lifetime? At the level of significance 0.05 or 5%. So the first step is to establish the criteria to perform the hypothesis test. So we know that because NP1 minus P, or 1,561 times 0.60 times 1 minus 0.60 is 374.6, which is greater than 10, we know that the sample is random in less than 5% of the population. So step 2 is to determine the proportion of the sample. So we know that P hat equals X over N, which is 954 over 1,561, which equals to 0.61. So step 3 is to determine the null and alternative hypothesis. So because the question is asking for the to see if this is sufficient evidence enough that the supermajority of Americans, we know that the alternative hypothesis is P is greater than 0.60, and the null is just P equals 0.60. And because it's asking for greater than, P is greater than 0.60, we know that this is a right-tailed problem. So step 4 is to establish the level of significance where we can determine that just from the problem. It's 0.005. And then step 5 is to test the statistic. So we know that the formula for the z-score for hypothesis testing for one proportion is p hat minus p divided by the square root of p times 1 minus p over n, which equals 0.61, because we know p hat equals 2.61, minus 0.60, divided by the square root of 0.60 times 1 minus 0.60 over 1,561, which equals to 0.81. So now we have to decide if we want to use the classical approach or the p-value approach. I used the classical approach, so my first step was to determine the critical value at a level significance of 0.05. So we can see that on the Z table, 5% corresponds to 1.645 because it's in between these two numbers. So now we have to look at the rule for a right-tailed problem is the Z has to be greater than the level of significance if we reject the null hypothesis. But we can see here that 0.81 is less than 1.645. So we do not reject the null hypothesis. And the interpretation of this is we do not reject the null hypothesis because there is sufficient evidence to show that a supermajority of Americans did not feel the U.S. would have to fight Japan within their lifetime.